So yes, my name is Isa, and I'm a first-year linguistic anthropology student here at the GC. And I'm super excited to introduce our guest speaker, Kristin G. Hickman. Kristin, thank you so much for being here. She used to be my preceptor at Chicago when I completed my master's thesis, so I'm very excited. So Kristin is the Croft Assistant Professor of Anthropology and International Studies at the University of Mississippi. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and her research currently examines the relationship between language, politics, and cultural production, in particular in Morocco. She's also the recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Award for her next project, which she will conduct in the summer of the next year. And today, the paper she will be presenting is titled Articulating Morocco, Language, Identity, and Belonging After Arabization. So let's give a warm round of welcome to Kristin. And Kristin, I'll let you take it from here.
So thank you, Isa, for your introduction. It's really great to see you. And thank you to the organizers of the CUNY Sociolinguistics Speaker Series for inviting me and for putting everything together. Obviously, in a different world, I wish this could have been an opportunity to meet all of you in person, but in the Zoom world that we live in right now, a virtual meeting will have to do. So let me share my screen. Everyone can see that, and hopefully the sound is going to work. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'm going to be talking to you all about today is my current book project, which is tentatively titled Articulating Morocco, Language, Identity, and Belonging After Arabization. In broad strokes, Articulating Morocco looks at a political and economic shift that began taking place in Morocco in the early 2000s, when the government, or more specifically the King Mohammed VI, initiated a move away from the Middle East and towards both Europe and the African continent. And what the book project focuses on is how this larger effort to resituate or reimagine Morocco has changed the relationship that ordinary Moroccans have to language, and specifically to colloquial Moroccan Arabic, locally referred to as Darija. In other words, my project explores language as a site where ordinary people try to make sense of the larger political and economic shifts of which they're a part. And what I argue, based on my ethnographic research with several groups of language activists, artists, and language professionals in Casablanca, is that what was happening on the ground was a process that I'm calling articulation. Oops, there we go. Okay. And what I mean, and I mean this term in both senses. So there's the linguistic sense of articulation, meaning the pronunciation of sound or the expression of an idea in a clear and coherent manner. But then there's the more physiological sense of articulation, meaning the formation of joints or the formation of points of connection between two body parts. And so what I try to do in my project is to conceptualize articulation as a way to think about how Moroccans are engaging with the king's larger politics. On the one hand, I look at how Moroccans are figuring out what it means to disconnect their country and their identity from the Middle East, and specifically the Arab world, and instead to reimagine it as part of or as articulating with Africa and Europe. And on the other hand, I look at how this more physiological process of articulation is caught up with speech and language. So essentially, my project asks, how does connecting Morocco to a new regional body entail speaking Morocco in a new way? Or to put it really simply, how are Moroccans making sense of a shift away from the Arab world through language? But before I get too deep into the project, let me just give you a quick outline of how my talk is going to be organized today. So for the first part of the talk, I'm going to speak a bit more about the book project itself to give you a sense of where I see my project situated within the larger literature, but I think it contributes to ongoing conversations. After that, in the second part of the talk, I'll be speaking more in depth about Morocco's fraught relationship with the Middle East and the Arab world, as well as how the current king is shifting the country towards Europe and more importantly, towards sub-Saharan Africa. And then finally, in the third and fourth parts of my talk, I'll be discussing how the king's politics are being taken up on the ground in Casablanca, pictured here on the right, and how the king's politics are getting refracted through the lens of language. So to do this, I'll discuss two chapters from my larger book project. The first looks at a dubbing studio in Casablanca, which is responsible for dubbing foreign soap operas into Moroccan Arabic, again known as Darija. And here, what I'll focus on is how dubbing ends up circumventing the stigmatization of Darija within the larger Arab world by crafting a new register of the language. And then in the second chapter, I'll be discussing the growing presence of non-native Darija speakers in Morocco, the vast majority of whom are West African immigrants. And here what I'll be focusing on are Moroccans' reactions to the rising use of Darija by these West Africans, a phenomena which seems to mark a desired shift away from Arab periphery and towards Morocco being an African center. And yet, as I'll show, this raises a new set of unexpected problems. And I'll just say up front that it might be a bit overly ambitious to talk to you about both of these chapters today, but I really see them as working together to explore the trickiness of Morocco's political and linguistic ideological shift towards new modes of regional belonging. So my hope is that even in truncated forms, they'll provide some fodder for a productive discussion afterwards. So as I mentioned, articulating Morocco takes as its starting point a political and economic shift that began in the 2000s, during which the king started redirecting Morocco away from the Arab world in the east and towards Europe to the north and the African continent to the south. And the question my project asks is, how has this larger political and economic shift changed Moroccans' relationship to language? Specifically, how has it changed their relationship to Moroccan Arabic? But if we frame the project in a broader sense, the question it's really posing is, how do ordinary people make sense of the larger global shifts that they're a part of? How do they make sense of political maneuvers happening at the international scale in which they are implicated, whether they want to be or not? How do ordinary people rethink their terms of belonging when they suddenly find themselves to be, for example, holders of a new citizenship that didn't previously exist, or living on land that's transferred hands, or living on land that's been reimagined as an entirely new political entity? So I'm sure we can all think of various examples of this. The fall of the Soviet Union is one example that might jump to mind, or even the current moment we're living in the US, which at least to me increasingly feels like an empire in decline. But again, one of the questions that emerges in moments like this is, how are such massive shifts experienced on the ground? How do people negotiate new ways of situating themselves in the world, new modes of belonging in the wake or in the midst of these sorts of massive shifts that can completely alter our sense of geography, our sense of borders, our sense of identities? So what I want to do now is to take a minute to briefly talk about 3 studies that have really sparked my interest, because they've approached this question in different ways, and as a result, they've been really informative in shaping my own approach to this topic. So the first example I'll quickly mention is Sarah Abreva-Stein's research on the complicated status of Ottoman Jews in the 19th and early 20th century, as the Ottoman Empire was in the process of dissolving and as new states were being born. This was obviously a massive and prolonged event that left countless populations trying to figure out how to make sense of who they were, where they belonged, what their identity was, now that they were no longer subjects of a multi-ethnic, multi-faith empire, but rather citizens of newly emerging, much more homogeneous nation states. And what Stein does is she looks at how Ottoman Jews, many of whom lived on the margins of the empire, strategically sought out various European citizenships in the hopes of being transformed from Ottoman Jew into, for example, Portuguese citizen. And in her research, Stein does a really great job of highlighting the legal complexity that accompanies the decline of empire, particularly for people living on the margins. She really shows how the question of belonging in the midst of political upheaval can end up being a strategic game of navigating multiple citizenships. But what she attends less to is how these new legal statuses acquired by Ottoman Jews informed or shaped their sense of belonging, their sense of their place in the world. Conversely, a body of literature that focuses more on this is some of the recent anthropological research that's been done on Portugal. So here I'm thinking, for example, of Lila Ellen Gray's work on fado music in Lisbon, which frames fado, and particularly amateur fado, as a site where ordinary inhabitants of Lisbon try to collectively make sense of what it means for them to be citizens of a country that was once an imperial empire, but which now resides on the periphery of Europe. Likewise, Keisha Fike's ethnography of Portugal takes a similar approach by tackling questions of belonging and identity. But whereas Gray looks at what it means for Portuguese citizens to reckon with a former empire becoming a much smaller, much poorer nation state, Fikes looks at how Portuguese citizens reckon with their country's incorporation into the European Union. And her approach to doing this is to look at how poor Portuguese women navigate their new status as EU citizens by enacting new ideologies of difference, in this case, racialized ideologies of difference, vis-a-vis women from Cape Verde, whom they had previously worked alongside. So drawing on the approaches of people like Gray and Fikes, Articulating Morocco explores how Moroccans make sense of their place in the world and their country's place in the world in the wake of the decline of Pan-Arabism, a political ideology that located Morocco in the Arab world and yet on its margins. As the current king's politics reorient the country away from the Arab world and towards its neighbors in Europe and Africa, my project traces what new regional positionings become possible. My goal, however, is not to focus on economic accords or citizenship regimes or diplomatic agreements over borders, nor is it to ask necessarily how these larger changes impacted people in their daily lives, as if Moroccans were simply receptacles of top-down government policies. Rather, I'm interested in how ordinary Moroccans, and specifically urban Moroccans, are negotiating, debating, disagreeing over, and creatively reworking these new horizons in their everyday lives. And so again, the question my project tackles is, how are Moroccans making sense of the shift away from the Arab world through language? Or to put it slightly differently, how does locating Morocco within a new geography enable Moroccans to reconceptualize Darija differently? Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know exactly where Morocco is, it's located on the northwest corner of Africa, and it's what's often imagined as the westernmost edge of the Arabo-Islamic world. From 1912 to 1956, it became a protectorate of both France and Spain. Spain was given control of the northern mountains that border the Mediterranean, as well as the southern half of the country, what you can see here in purple marked as the Western Sahara. France, conversely, was granted the much more fertile central part of Morocco that encompasses cities like Rabat, Fez, and Marrakesh. And in 1956, Morocco gained independence, but it remained a monarchy. So it was first under the reign of Mohammed V, who you can see in the chair, and who had been a rallying point for Moroccan anti-colonial nationalists during the protectorate. Then beginning in 1961, it was under the reign of his son, Hassan II, who you can see here kissing his father's hand. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that both kings located Morocco firmly within the Arab world. And one not insignificant reason for this was the monarchy's entanglement with the Istiqlal Party, a pan-Arabist party that had been at the forefront of anti-colonial politics during the protectorate era, and which had played a crucial role in securing Moroccan independence, and therefore in returning power to the Moroccan monarchy. So in aligning Morocco with the pan-Arabism espoused by the Istiqlal Party, both Mohammed V and Hassan II essentially adopted a powerful ideology that created an imaginative geography of a region pulled together by Arabness. Nowadays, of course, the term pan-Arabism is most closely associated with the golden age of the ideology in the 50s and 60s, and with political leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who famously nationalized the Suez Canal. But pan-Arabism, or more broadly Arab nationalism, was actually a movement that emerged during the Ottoman Empire and which sought to transcend modes of ethnic and especially religious belonging by underlining the importance of linguistic belonging through the Arabic language. Now, belonging through the Arabic language is a tricky thing because, as it turns out, not all Arabics and not all Arabs were created equally. And perhaps the easiest way to explain this is through Atika Hashemi's concept of the Maghreb-Mashreq language ideology. So in short, the Maghreb is an Arabic term meaning the place of the West. Mashreq is an Arabic term meaning the place of the East. And these two terms, broadly speaking, map onto the more commonly used English language terms, North Africa and the Middle East. So the Maghreb is North Africa and the Mashreq is the Middle East. And in her research, Hashemi argues that there is a sociolinguistic hierarchy that exists between these two Arab regions. Basically, Mashreqi or Eastern varieties of Arabic are more valued and heard as being closer to Standard Arabic, which is the official written standard from Oman to Morocco. And the Maghrebi or Western varieties of Arabic are comparatively devalued and heard as being further from Standard Arabic. And as you've probably figured out, this hierarchy is often seen as emerging naturally from the landscape itself. So the closer you are geographically to the core, to the Arabian Peninsula, the purer your Arabic is. And conversely, the further you are from the core, the more corrupted your Arabic is. And so again, looking at this map, you can probably guess that Morocco's geographical location goes hand in hand with an extreme linguistic devaluation of Moroccan Arabic, as well as a devaluation of the country's relative importance in the eyes of the larger Arab world. And yet, this is the situation that both Mohammed V and Hassan II had to contend with in adopting a pan-Arab ideology. Nonetheless, both kings made clear decisions in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy that reinscribed a pan-Arab view of the world, as well as Morocco's position within it. So under Hassan II, for example, Morocco adopted a constitution revised 4 times during his reign that defined the country as a Muslim country whose official language was Arabic, a move that essentially erased the Amazigh or Berber speakers who make up nearly half of Morocco's population and who are arguably the indigenous people of the country. And this constitutional definition of Morocco as an Arab country was not only symbolically important, it also set the stage for domestic Arabization policies. So these were essentially policies that aimed at the linguistic transition of bureaucracies, legal system, education from French and Spanish into Standard Arabic, right? Notably not into Moroccan Arabic, into Standard Arabic. So Morocco began implementing Arabization policies soon after independence, and in doing so, it was essentially following the lead of other newly independent Arab countries. In Morocco, however, these Arabization policies faced particular obstacles, partly because of the large number of Berber speakers, partly because of the distance between Standard Arabic and Moroccan Arabic, partly because of poor implementation, but also in part because of a lack of general human resources, to the extent that Morocco actually had to import Arabic instructors from Middle Eastern countries like Syria and Egypt, where Arabization had been more successful. And just to give you a sense of the risks that existed to Arabization policies in Morocco, here's a cartoon, although I'm not sure what year it's from exactly. And in it, the boy is likely reading a book in Standard Arabic, but then in Moroccan Arabic, he's complaining and saying, why do they teach us Arabic when they put us to work in French? So alongside these Arabization policies, Hassan II also performatively presented Morocco as an Arab country on the world stage. Morocco became a member of the Arab League, pictured here in 1958, and actually under the reign of Hassan II, who you can see in the middle, Morocco hosted a whopping 6 Arab League summits from 1965 to 1989. And to give you a sense of how many that is, the only other country that's hosted that many Arab League summits is Egypt. And so this should give you a sense of how under Hassan II, Morocco became institutionally linked to the Middle East. And throughout his reign, Hassan II really fought, arguably unsuccessfully, to challenge Morocco's marginal position within a pan-Arabist worldview. And so in addition to doing things like hosting Arab League summits, he also put an enormous amount of effort into positioning himself as an Arab power broker of sorts, and specifically as a key negotiator in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So for example, he played an important role in the Camp David Accords. In contrast, his son, the current king of Morocco, Mohammed VI, has set a very different course for the country. Quite noticeably, on the global stage, Mohammed VI has been conspicuously absent from many of the Arab League summits. He hasn't actually attended one since 2005. Instead, he's been sending his brother or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And equally noticeably, since he became king, Morocco has not hosted a single Arab League summit. They were actually scheduled to host one in 2016, but the king backed out at the last minute, with the excuse being that he did not want to give a false impression of unity in the Arab world. So what's become clear over the years is that unlike his father, Mohammed VI is not interested in the rhetoric or the ideology of Pan-Arabism. He's not interested in occupying a marginal position within that imaginative geography or in trying to negotiate his way to the center of it. Rather, he's repositioning both himself and his country as African and as a bridge to Europe. And this has involved, on the one hand, strategically positioning Morocco as a sort of border guard for the European Union, a position which comes with economic and political benefits. And on the other hand, this has involved strategically positioning Morocco as a new, powerful cosmopolitan center within Africa. Morocco, for example, rejoined the African Union in 2017, and this marked the solidification of what the French newspaper Le Monde nicely dubbed the African Empire of Mohammed VI. And they described it in the following terms, quote, "Since his arrival to the throne in 1999, Mohammed VI has led an ambitious African politics. Under his impetus, the kingdom has set out on an assault of the continent. Methodically, in stages, it has woven its tapestry. In 15 years, the king has made more than 40 visits to the countries of sub-Saharan Africa and mobilized the largest Moroccan companies, employing all of his economic, diplomatic, and even religious resources," end quote. So domestically, this translates into a very different kind of identity being promoted on the ground in Morocco itself. Arabization policies have essentially been declared failure. Morocco's begun shifting more and more of its schooling into French and even into English. And throughout the country, Africa Morocco's own Africanness, its Africanité, are on display more than ever before in museums, in public concerts, on television, in the news. And as of 2011, the country's Africanness and its Europeanness were both officially enshrined in the constitution. So as of 2011, the preamble to the Moroccan constitution now reads, "A sovereign Muslim state attached to its national unity and to its territorial integrity, the Kingdom of Morocco intends to preserve in its plenitude and its diversity, its one and indivisible national identity. Its unity is forged by the convergence of its Arab Islamist, Amazigh, Berber, and Saharan Hassanic components, nourished and enriched by its African, Andalusian, Hebraic, and Mediterranean influences." Okay. So the takeaway here should be clear. Instead of locating Morocco on the periphery of the Arab world, both politically and linguistically, Mohammed VI has broken with his father by reimagining Morocco as hybrid. And this move has crucially involved relocating or rearticulating the country, one, as a bridge to Europe, but two, as a new center of Africa. And so in my larger book project, I look at how this political and economic shift in Morocco has refracted on the ground, enabling or opening up new conversations about Morocco's place in the world. What I argue is that these new conversations have, in part, taken place through conversations about colloquial Moroccan Arabic, again, locally called Darija. So in the first part of the book, for example, I look at an initial wave of Darija language activists in the early 2000s who argued that Darija was not actually Arabic. In essence, these activists argued for the un-Arabness of Darija, which many of them instead referred to as Moroccan, Maghribiya, or the Moroccan language, Al-Lugha al-Maghribiya. And actually, thus far, most of the research that's been done on the Darija question in Morocco has focused on this group of early activists. But part of what I hope to show in my larger book project is that these activists are only the tip of the iceberg. In the rest of my book project, I try to expand the scope of inquiry by looking at other discussions about Darija happening in Casablanca, and that is what I'm going to turn to right now. Okay, so Morocco has two main television stations. Channel 1, known as Al-Ula, which literally means first in standard Arabic, and Channel 2, known as Deuxième or 2M in French. And as the names of the channels suggest, Al-Ula offers more programming in standard Arabic, whereas Deuxième offers more programming in French. Beginning in 2006, however, Moroccan television witnessed a notable increase in Darija language programming. And interestingly, the growth of shows in Darija, Moroccan Arabic, wasn't so much on Al-Ula, the standard Arabic channel, as it was on Deuxième, the predominantly French language channel. Due to financial constraints, however, Deuxième didn't actually have the budget to produce an entirely new slate of Darija language television programs from scratch. So instead, they decided to try something new, dubbing foreign soap operas into Moroccan Arabic. And just to give you a quick sense of what this looked like and sounded like, I'm going to play you a very short clip of one of them.
كيعجبني بزاف هادشي اللي كدير.
هادشي معناه بلي موافقة؟
حنا بقينا مفارقين بزاف ديال الوقت. أنا ما بغيتش نزيد مازال دقيقة واحدة وأنا بعيد عليك.
ولكن باقا كاع ما جاوبتيني على الطلب ديالي. ولا لا؟
وباقي مازال شك. معلوم معلوم.
Okay, so that was a clip from a Mexican telenovela titled Las Dos Caras de Ana, The Two Sides of Ana. And in 2006, it became the first foreign soap opera to be dubbed into Darija. And when it was broadcast, it caused an uproar in the Moroccan press. Now, I should specify here that Ana was not the first foreign show on Moroccan television to be dubbed into an Arabic dialect. By 2006, Moroccan TV channels had already broadcast numerous foreign television shows and foreign movies dubbed into French, standard Arabic, and various Middle Eastern dialects. And this included several foreign soap operas dubbed into Syrian Arabic. So the uproar about Ana clearly didn't have to do with the foreign content of the show, nor did it have to do with the dubbing per se. Rather, the problem was that the dubbing was in Darija. So let me take a moment to explain this. Prior to Ana, the programming on Deuxième had fit within what Hashemi has called the Maghreb Mashriq language ideology, in which Middle Eastern varieties are seen as valuable and understandable, and North African varieties are seen as sort of corrupted and confusing. So within this ideological framework, it made sense that the media that was intended to be consumed across the Arab world would be either in standard Arabic or in a prestige dialect like Egyptian or Syrian. Alongside that, shows intended to be consumed domestically, like low-budget Moroccan sitcoms, would be in Darija, the logic being that no other Arabic-speaking country would be interested in watching, let alone capable of understanding something in Moroccan Arabic. In this context, dubbing a Moroccan telenovela into Moroccan Arabic was a statement, in part to the rest of the Arab world, but really to Moroccans themselves. And this message was perhaps best summed up by the deputy director of Juzam itself, Samir Stail, who explicitly stated on a radio show in French, Morocco is not an Arab country, we're a Maghrebian country, i.e. a North African country. And indeed, the slew of Mexican and Turkish soap operas that dubbed into Darija over the next decade and a half seemed to further underline this point. Many of the soap operas that Juzam broadcast in Darija had already been dubbed into Syrian Arabic, actually. And so what the Darija versions did was basically to break Arab audiences in two. And I'll just note that I've heard anecdotally that these Juzam Darija dubbing productions are actually really popular amongst North Africans or Maghrebians living in France, which really gives a sense of how these shows promote a Maghrebian identity more than an Arab or a pan-Arab one. So the anti-pan-Arabist subtext of these dubbed soap operas might have been subtle, but it was nonetheless understood by conservative politicians who came out strongly against Darija dubbing over the subsequent decade, despite not having said a word about similar shows dubbed into other Arabic dialects. Officially, their argument tended to be that it was dangerous to have these shows in Darija because ordinary Moroccans would end up seeing foreign people doing foreign things in Moroccan Arabic and thus assumed that it was okay for Moroccans to do these foreign things as well. Conversely, they seemed to assume that if a show was in standard Arabic, it would create a mental distance for a viewer, so that basically if a soap opera star was speaking in standard Arabic, a Moroccan viewer wouldn't confuse them for a Moroccan, and thus they wouldn't confuse the star's behavior as being appropriate for Moroccans. And one example of this kind of sentiment is a comment that came from the Minister of Communication, who said that, quote, the use of Darija in these shows might create a contradiction of values linked to other societies and engender negative behaviors that don't belong to our culture, end quote. But interestingly, alongside these conservatives' concerns that the average Moroccan viewer would be too accepting of foreigners on television speaking in Darija, the Francophone liberals in Morocco were actually concerned about the opposite. That is, they were worried that the average Moroccan viewer would be uncomfortable watching foreigners speaking in Darija. In other words, from a liberal Francophone perspective, the concern was Moroccan was too deeply entrenched in a pan-Arabist language ideology that stigmatized Moroccan Arabic as provincial. And as a result, the average Moroccan would find it completely bizarre to see a glamorous foreigner using such provincial language, because of course, glamorous foreigners were supposed to speak standard Arabic or Egyptian or Syrian, not Moroccan. And so the quote I have here, which I'll read in a minute, is a great example of this kind of liberal anxiety about the problematic pan-Arabist language ideology of the masses. It's actually an excerpt from a well-known liberal Francophone news magazine, and it's specifically taken from a regular column that offers sort of humorous social critique through fictional stories about a Moroccan Joe Schmo named Zakaria Boualem, who you can see here on the left. And in this particular column, Zakaria is watching what else but a Mexican soap opera dubbed into Darija. So Zakaria bursts into laughter. Ignacio is declaring his love to beautiful Isabella. شتي يا إيزابيلا أنا كان موت عليك والله ما كنت خايش الحياة بلا بيك راني عيت. See, Isabella, I'm in love with you. I swear, I can't imagine my life without you. It's too much. And Isabella answers him, أنا ماشي ديال طفلية. إذا كنت باغي شي حاجة ديال بصح عيط الوالد وشوف معاه شي حل. I'm not just something you can play with. If you want something real, call my father and find a solution. Zachariah's laugh is logical. For him, Ignacio, being a foreigner, cannot speak Darija. And this Ignacio has a strong accent from Hai Hassani, which is a working class neighborhood in Casablanca. This laugh is vexing because we, Moroccans, do not react to seeing Comanche Indians speaking French and Westerns, but the use of Darija in our minds is systematically associated at best with humor and derision and at worst with vulgarity. So what Al-Ali is pointing to here is this inability to imagine telenovela stars let alone Comanche Indians speaking in Darija. And this is important, and importantly, this is not actually a problem for French, nor is it a problem for other Arabic dialects like Egyptian. It's really a problem unique to North African dialects, right? So Arabic speakers don't find it weird, for example, for Disney cartoons to be dubbed into Egyptian Arabic, but that's because Egyptian Arabic has been one of the prestige registers in the Arabic-speaking world. Conversely, as a marginalized register, Darija never gets used to translate foreignness. That is, until Dozam started producing these soap opera shows, and I think that's what Alali's point is here. So to articulate this in a slightly different way, within Hashemi's Maghreb Mashrek language ideology, the only Arabic voices from nowhere that exist are prestige versions of Egyptian and Syrian Arabic. And when I say that Egyptian and Syrian can be heard as voices from nowhere, I don't just mean nowhere in Egypt or nowhere in Syria. I mean nowhere in the world. Conversely, Moroccan Arabic is always heard as a voice from somewhere. It's always placed, it can't be anonymous or unmarked. And that's why it's difficult to imagine Moroccan Arabic coming from the body of a telenovela star or a Comanche Indian, as it were. And so what I argue in this chapter is that since Anna first aired in 2006, Darija dubbing has served as a sort of experimental space for creating a new voice from nowhere at two different levels. So first, it's been a space for crafting a Moroccan national voice from nowhere, a voice that within Morocco can be heard by Moroccans as void of regional difference. But more importantly, it's been a space for crafting a voice from nowhere at a second level, a voice that Moroccans can plausibly imagine as coming not just from anywhere in their country, but from anywhere and anybody in the world. And in doing so, it hasn't so much changed or transformed a pan-Arabist vision of Moroccan marginality as much as it's circumvented it. Because these soap operas dubbed into Darija, they're not being picked up by Middle Eastern stations. They're not being watched by Egyptians or Syrians, so they're not changing how Middle Easterners view North Africans, but they are changing how North Africans and Moroccans in particular view or hear themselves as no longer beholden to playing a marginal role in the Arab world, and perhaps is no longer beholden to the Arab world point blank. And so while I don't have much time to get into it right now, what I do in this chapter is I spend time looking at the linguistic and linguistic ideological negotiations that take place in the dubbing studio itself. So basically, Dozam contracts with one dubbing studio in Casablanca to do all of its Darija dubbing. And so what I did for much of my field work is I watched sound engineers, voice actors, and translators as they were cobbling together this Darija voice from nowhere, right? And again, what they were trying to craft was not just a voice from nowhere in Morocco, but a voice from nowhere in the world, a voice that could plausibly be imagined as coming from a body and a face of a Muslim Turk or a Catholic Mexican. And the takeaway here is that being able to hear Darija, not just as a dialect, but as a language, a neutral language that can be spoken by foreigners, is a linguistic means of imagining or articulating Morocco as something other than Arab periphery. Right? This strange new register opens up a new linguistic space for rethinking Darija and ultimately for rethinking Morocco. So the next chapter of my book project shifts from exploring how Moroccans are articulating Morocco and Moroccan Arabic as something other than Arab periphery to exploring how Moroccans are articulating their country and their language as African. Specifically, I shift from debates about Darija emanating from telenovela stars to debates about Darija emanating from actual foreigners living in Moroccan cities. And while some of these foreigners happen to be American anthropologists, the vast majority of them, the ones that most occupy the Moroccan imagination, are sub-Saharan African immigrants. And so just to give you a sense of the numbers here, when Morocco did its last census in 2014, sub-Saharan Africans made up the second largest number of foreigners in the country, comprising more than 1/4 of all foreigners. And notably, this number is twice as large as the number of Middle Eastern immigrants, and it's larger than the number of Middle Eastern and North African immigrants combined together. Now, from both a Moroccan and a European perspective, sub-Saharan African immigrants living in Morocco are often assumed to be illegal. And this is in part because Morocco has been and continues to be an important transit point for migration from Africa to Europe, both legal and illegal. So here, for example, you can see the routes that migrants often take to get to Europe, many of which obviously pass through Morocco. That said, sub-Saharan Africans in Morocco are an incredibly diverse population. There are large numbers of West African businessmen and women. There are scholarship students studying at Moroccan universities. There are imams training at Moroccan religious institutes, and there's even a huge number of call center workers. So by some accounts, there's as many as 10,000 Senegalese call center workers in Morocco. And while many of these immigrants speak French, a growing number are beginning to pick up Darija as well as a way to integrate better into Moroccan life. So one example is a Guinean student I met in 2017 who I'll call Abdoulaye. Abdoulaye was a fluent Francophone who had come to study at a Moroccan university along with a large delegation of other Guinean scholarship students. And when he first arrived several years prior to our meeting, he found his new life in Morocco to be very difficult. For the first few months, he said it felt like Moroccans would invent a new racist epithet for him and the other Guinean students every few months. Mika, black plastic bag, zitoun, black olive, or even Ebola. If in a given week, the Moroccan national soccer team won a match against a team from sub-Saharan Africa, Abdoulaye and his classmates would temporarily take on that nationality in the eyes of Moroccans. More often though, they just referred to them as Senegalese. Over time, however, Abdoulaye managed to learn Darija, and that changed everything. At first, he began by learning words here and there with the help of some Moroccan students who lived next to him in the university dormitory. He'd build rapport with them through playing soccer together, and they subsequently became his ad hoc Darija tutors. Abdoulaye explained to me that he felt he needed to take a step towards Moroccans, that it was incumbent upon him to make an explicit first step to integrate, and learning Darija was that step. Ultimately, his gamble seemed to work. When we met, he was married to a Moroccan woman whose family had blessed their marriage, and they were living in an apartment above the woman's grandmother's house, who apparently was very fond of him. But if people like Abdoulaye were increasingly present on Moroccan streets, they were also increasingly visible and audible in Moroccan media. While much of the Moroccan media featuring sub-Saharan African voices was in French, during my fieldwork, I noticed a small but growing presence of sub-Saharan African voices in Darija as well. So one example was on the popular TV show Generation News. This particular episode was called The Adjustment of Young Sub-Saharan Africans in Morocco, and it featured 3 guests who you can see here. There's Tafsir on the right, a Guinean PhD student in Islamic studies who'd been in Rabat for 10 years, Kader, who's in the middle wearing the hat, a Guinean choreographer who'd been living in Marrakesh for over 10 years, and Ousmane on the left, a Senegalese BA student in engineering who'd been living in Rabat for 4 years. Like Abdoulaye, all 3 of these men were fluent Francophones who had learned Darija to better integrate into Moroccan society. And on the show, they discussed how they saw their linguistic efforts as contributing to African unity. So here's a quote from Kader to that effect. Praise be to God, alhamdulillah, we're living in a transitional period thanks to His Majesty King Mohammed VI, who's currently making an enormous effort. And God willing, inshallah, future generations and even generations now will understand this effort that's being done for African integration. It's something that's important. And us, we are the ambassadors today of this African integration. And God willing, people will see that integration as possible. We are the proof today. We're living in Morocco and we're speaking Darija. And this was in Darija, what he said. And so what I want to point to here is that over the past decade or so, in part due to African immigrants like Kader and Abdoulaye, Darija has really become a public language in a way that it had not been previously, and in a way that had previously been unimaginable. Within a pan-Arabist framework, it's always Moroccans who have to adjust linguistically to other Arabic speakers, something that I experienced firsthand when an Egyptian friend came to visit me in the field, and suddenly all of my Moroccan friends began speaking Egyptian Arabic. There's never really been an expectation for anyone else, Arab or non-Arab, to adjust to Moroccans by speaking Moroccan Arabic. And yet, over the past decade or so, a growing number of African immigrants have begun doing just that. How have Moroccans reacted to this? So what I show in this chapter is that West Africans speaking Darija have become a sign for many Moroccans of their country's Africanness, and more importantly, of its new status as a kind of African cosmopolis. In other words, for many Moroccans, people like Kader and Abdoulaye function as evidence that Morocco is no longer Arab periphery, but rather African center. So one example I came across in the field of this kind of uptake was a stand-up comedy set by a local comedian named Saad Mabrouk. Saad described his stand-up as sparkling Franco-Darija humor, humour Franco-Darija pétillant. And in describing it in this way, he explicitly contrasted it with the vast majority of Darija comedy that existed, which he saw as self-denigrating because it often focused on making fun of Moroccans and particularly poking fun at the figure of the Aroubi, the Moroccan country bumpkin, epitomized by Morocco's most famous comedian Hassan al-Fad. And in this slide, you can see al-Fad playing the role of the Aroubi alongside his equally Aroubia wife. In contrast to al-Fad's provincial Darija humor, Saad consciously strove to create a sort of cosmopolitan Darija humor. And he did this in part by targeting a Franco-Darija audience composed not just of Moroccans, but also of West Africans. So for example, in the set that I watched, he actually did an entire skit in a combination of Darija and French about West Africans working in a Moroccan call center. And it was based on his own experience working with West Africans in a Moroccan call center. And what stood out to me during the skit was that actually the audience members who laughed the hardest at his jokes were West African immigrants, one of whom literally fell out of his chair laughing. But if this new potential for Darija to be a public language, an African public language, was on celebratory display in Saad's stand-up, elsewhere it became a source of discomfort and debate. And so in the last section of this chapter, I ask, what are the stakes of Darija becoming a public language? And to quickly touch on this, I want to end with a brief discussion of an anti-racism campaign that emerged in 2014, in which prominently featured a man clearly intended to be sub-Saharan African, speaking in Darija. So here's what the campaign looked like. And as you can see, there was a French version of it, as well as a Darija version, although interestingly, to my knowledge, there was no standard Arabic version. And in both French and Darija, the sort of speech bubble you see at the bottom there says, "My name is not Azzi. Je ne m'appelle pas Azzi, mais smichish Azzi." So what is Azzi? Azzi is a derogatory word in Moroccan Arabic used to refer to Black people, both Black Moroccan people and Black non-Moroccan people. But it doesn't have a denotational meaning of Black or of any color, actually. And denotationally, it doesn't even mean something negative. So etymologically, it's connected to the Arabic root az, which can mean strength as well as something that's dear. And as a result, during my fieldwork, I heard a lot of Moroccans argue that even though the word is used to refer to Black people, it's not offensive. So this campaign sparked a flurry of public debate in Morocco, much of which was about whether or not this term, Azzi, was offensive, but it was also about Darija as a language, and specifically, who has the right to make arguments about Darija? Who has the right to say what a word means or what it doesn't mean? Who has the right to dictate what should or shouldn't be said in Darija? To put it another way, the campaign decoupled being a Darija speaker from being an ethnic Moroccan, not unlike what the dubbed soap operas did. But whereas the decoupling of Moroccan Arabic from ethnic Moroccan bodies on TV elicited uncomfortable laughter, the anti-racism campaign's decoupling of Moroccan Arabic from ethnic Moroccan bodies really struck a nerve with a lot of Moroccans. And in this way, the situation of Darija in Morocco is actually not dissimilar from what Catherine Woolard describes in her work on Catalan. In her most recent book, she traces a shift over time from a situation she calls ethno-linguistic authenticity, in which the Catalan language was protected as the quasi-exclusive domain of ethnic Catalans, towards a contemporary situation in which the Catalan language and Catalan identity are increasingly seen as no longer delimited by ethnicity, but rather as open to others, including, for example, the children of Castilian-speaking migrants. And this linguistic ideological shift, Woolard shows, is reflected in the current sovereignty movement itself. Similarly, what I try to describe in this chapter is a linguistic ideological shift around Darija that is beginning to decouple language from ethnic Moroccan bodies. And in doing so, it's opening up new, larger questions about the Moroccan nation, and specifically whether it's possible to imagine a Moroccan national identity that's not only influenced by Africa, as the Constitution states, but is actually broad enough to include sub-Saharan African immigrants and their Moroccan-born children within it. And so just to finish up here, I hope I've given you some glimpse of how disarticulating Morocco from the Middle East and re-articulating it or connecting it with Africa is a process that's inextricably tied up with language. Moroccan sense of their language, of Darija, its value, its qualities, has until now really been defined by a pan-Arabist language ideology, right? What Hashemi calls the Maghreb Mashriq language ideology. And the qualities of that language, of Darija, have been seen as resembling Moroccans themselves, a sort of iconicity in which both Moroccans and Moroccan Arabic are perceived as provincial, harsh, and ultimately not really Arab. What I've tried to look at today and what I try to do in the larger book project is to think about what it means, what it looks like, what it sounds like for Moroccans to articulate their country and their sense of belonging otherwise. For the king, of course, ignoring the Arab League and rejoining the African Union is simply a matter of politics and diplomacy, to some extent financial investment. But as I've tried to show today, the stakes are more complicated for people on the ground. Unthinking oneself and one's country as existing on the periphery of the Arab world and re-articulating Morocco as an African cosmopolis or an African metropole is a fraught process. And ultimately, what I hope to show in my book is that language, and specifically Moroccan Arabic, is a privileged place for working this out, for articulating Morocco in a new way. Thank you. That is all I have. I will unshare my screen now.
Thank you so much. So we have time for questions. If you have a question to ask, I ask that you either use the raise hand function or go in the chat, and then I will call on you, and then you can ask your question either verbally or I can read the chat questions out loud. And I see a question already. I forgot how your name was pronounced. Tejaswini?
Yeah, Tejaswini. Yeah, Tejaswini Ganti. Kristin, I'm trying to find you now on my, where did you go? Oh, there you are. Okay. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to the book when it comes out. I have obviously my questions are, I want to know more about the dubbing studio, and I guess one overall question was, I'm wondering if you had a sense, because you said they started dubbing in 2006, and I was wondering if you have a sense of like what governed that decision, since if things had been already being dubbed into Standard Arabic or Syrian Arabic, like what, kind of what, who or how did that decision get made in terms of dubbing into Darija? And then I was wondering, in your time in the dubbing studio, when you're watching voice artists and the other dubbing professionals, I'm curious about the kinds of discussion, like in terms of how voice artists or other dubbing professionals kind of discussed what they had to or not, like did they have to unlearn things if they had been already used to dubbing in Standard Arabic? And I'm just wondering, like in terms of their own kinds of relation, I'm just wondering about their own relationship to the language and the kind of language ideologies that you may have encountered within the dubbing studio.
Great, thank you. Those are wonderful questions. So the first question about why they started doing this in the first place in 2006. So it's a bit complicated. I know I paint a picture in my talk of this sort of smooth transition from Arabness to Africanness, but obviously these things are much messier on the ground, right? And so the king might want one thing, but the government might want another thing. And so actually what happened in 2006 is sort of in a bid to appease the conservative pan-Arabists that do still very much exist in the country, there was a decision to change, I think it's called the Cahier de Diffusion, for Duzam as a station. So their funding depends on various things, and it was decided that the ratio of language had to change. So before 2006, I think the ratio of language on Duzam was something like 70% French and 30% other stuff. In 2006, the new Cahier des Charges put together by the government promoting this sort of still pan-Arabist ideology said, okay, now I think it was 70% had to be in Standard Arabic, Amazigh, Berber, or Moroccan dialects, meaning Darija, and only 30% could be in French. So this was sort of a blow to Duzam, who was like, oh my God, how do we put together all of this new programming in these other languages? And they could have, obviously, I mean, what's fascinating to me is they could have just brought in Standard Arabic programming that already existed, things already dubbed into Standard Arabic, right? That would have been the pan-Arabist move to do, and they rejected that. Right. And so instead they said, no, we are going to start doing this new thing, which is dubbing in Darija. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background into why they did this. I mean, obviously they were pushed into a corner a bit, but they sort of transformed it in an unexpected way, which is in part why it became so scandalous later. And then, and I'll just add really quickly also, they then changed the cahier de charge later, and actually there was a threat because the conservatives hated the Darija dubbing so much. There was this threat that suddenly Darija language programming was going to be recategorized as foreign language programming. It didn't happen, but it was a threat that existed, and ideologically, it's really interesting to think about Darija getting categorized with French as opposed to with Standard Arabic. Anyways, in terms of in the studio, so there are a lot of discussions that happened. Interestingly, I think sort of what you were pointing to is whether any of the voice actors or the people in the studio had previously worked on Standard Arabic dubbing, and they hadn't. The vast majority of the people, of the actors who were doing the dubbing were amateurs or people who had been trained in theater and were trying to find some sort of employment. In the theater, some people ended up doing French, some people did Standard Arabic, some people did Moroccan Arabic, but these voice actors really didn't pander in Standard Arabic dubbing and Moroccan Arabic dubbing. They really just stuck with Moroccan Arabic dubbing and sort of saw it as their vocation. And so a lot of the discussions that ended up happening in the dubbing studio, on the one hand, with the translators who, sort of huge group of 15 people sitting in a room translating simultaneously, or the sound engineers and dubbing studio artists who were sort of in the studio together, would be, like I tried to sort of point out, on the one hand, putting together a national standard. So there'd be some discussions about, oh, why do you say Jewish instead of Jewish, right? Like, well, in Fez, we say it this way, in Rabat, we say it this way. No, we need to say it, right? So to some extent, it was the standard thing we've seen in linguistic anthropology, right, of putting together a national standard, but it was also more than that. And so one of the things I noticed that they did a lot is they would often try to take out religious phrases, particularly Moroccan religious phrases, because there were these questions of, well, would a Catholic Mexican say that? I don't know. And what was interesting is that it wasn't just about necessarily the religious identity of the characters, because they would do it for the Turks too, who are also Muslim, right? I don't know, should a Turk say inshallah? And Turks do say inshallah, but in Moroccan TV shows, they couldn't. It was too strange, right? And so one of the ways to not just create a national Darija, but sort of a cosmopolitan Darija, was to remove the religious content from it.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Rudy.
Hi, this is so exciting. I heard you give a talk at a conference a couple of years ago, and I remember thinking how much I loved what you were doing. So I'm really happy to hear more of it here, and can't wait to read the book. So I feel like I really just want to invite you out to dinner so I could have you to myself for a few hours, but I'll be more modest here, humble in my request, which is to focus more on it's related to the whole project, but your more final section on Africanness. I do research in Nigeria, and northern Nigeria, where I did my earlier work, has a long history with Morocco in terms of the Islamic learning and trade from those years. So it's always been of interest to me from those days. And then more recently, as I've been thinking about Nigeria's situation in the world, as a what Andrew Apter called a Pan-African nation, looking at Nigeria's attempt to kind of establish itself as a preeminent African cosmopolitan metropolitan center. I've been fascinated by just African as a term and what it refers to and what it connotes or indexes. And I've been really interested as teaching African studies about attempts by many scholars at different times to not limit Africa to sub-Saharan Africa, but the effort to include, let's say, North Africa, which is usually the first place people go to expand the concept. The Indian Ocean may be another, is often just to sort of include articles by people who did research in Tunisia or in Morocco without really engaging the Africanness of said material. And I can't help but be like a conversation analyst where I want to go like, well, how is it relevantly African? It is geographically African, but how's it relevantly African? And your work, one of the things that's so exciting for me is that I can include it in an African studies syllabus where Morocco is relevantly African, but as you're saying, as Wafa put in the chat, as Shugil Hamel has done with history of Blackness in Morocco, the Africanness of these places that haven't been canonically African is itself debatable, which of course makes it fascinating to put on an African studies syllabus, but it's not a straightforward, like, we're finally recognizing that Morocco's African and that's just it. So the fact that the king is making it a political move, I have one question about that, and then I have another question about where the ethnographic uptake or ethnographic evidence would be. Is the king's pivot towards Africa a way that he can now be not a periphery but on top of the pile or of the group he's in? And if that's the case, is that partly based on a racialized sense, a higher racial hierarchy, whereby Morocco is less Black and therefore, you know, kind of on better to lead Africa? It's a racist idea. I'm just wondering whether that's might be, if there's any evidence for that in it. And then when you described even some of your evidence of like the in African integration, like that discourse, made me think that even while the king might be claiming like we're African, and there's like that museum of African art that I've seen, I would love to see that museum. Like, is it the case in everyday speech that African denotes Moroccans who aren't Black? I mean, I can't help but think that there's some conflation of Africanness and Blackness, because I've heard that elsewhere. I remember asking a woman I met at a conference from Algeria about Algeria's Africanness, and she said, "Oh, we have a lot of Africans in Algeria."
I wish
and I was thinking, like, yeah, she wasn't Black, phenotypically Black, so it was sort of like, yeah, I think so, but you know, I didn't engage with her on that. Anyway, that was a lot. So it's really basically more, to sum it up, would be the political side and then the discourse of Africanness.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. Those are excellent questions. I'll also just say, because you started out by talking about Nigeria and Pan-Africanism, and there's a really great literature that already exists on sort of the debates that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Often through actually like film festivals about what was the correct place of North Africa in Africa. Was it part of Africa or was it not part of Africa? Was it a marginal part or was it a central part, right? And so there's already some really great literature on that. But what's really fascinating to me that literature brings out is that in an earlier moment, like right after independence, it wasn't clear that Morocco was Arab, right? And so there was a little bit more negotiation about whether or not North Africa was African or Arab. They were trying to figure it out themselves. And one place you see this really interestingly, there's a liberal Moroccan publication from the 60s called Soufl that was sort of very leftist and radical. And at first they started publishing it in the early 60s in French. And they did actually a lot of sort of like cross-reporting in West Africa. And then at a certain point in like 67, when Palestinian-Israeli stuff ramps up, they decide they're going to put together an Arab version alongside the French version. And then they decide they're going to completely cut the French version and only do the Arabic version. And it's really going to focus more on the Arab world. Right. And so anyways, which is just to say that, you know, this thing about Morocco being Arab, it's not that it's been like that forever, right? There was a moment when it was more in flux and then it sort of got doubled down on, right? But okay, putting that aside, in terms of why the king is doing it, I think you're absolutely right that it's a way for the king to sort of be on top politically, economically. I've had a lot of Moroccan people tell me, oh, he wants to be the new Gaddafi. Now that Gaddafi is dead, he sort of wants to take over that role, but maybe in a less like socialist way, let's say, and in a more capitalistic way. Morocco's always been really close to the West and to the United States in particular. Whether or not it's racialized, I'd have to think more about that. There's definitely a lot of really racialized discourse going on in Morocco, and Morocco is absolutely dealing with its past and present of anti-Black racism and its very close history of slavery, which didn't end until well into the 20th century. And so there might be a sense, right, a sense there, like you're suggesting, of Morocco, the king thinking that Morocco is better positioned to lead Africa because of its whiteness, essentially. But I'd have to think more about that to take a definite line. That said, I do think part of the pivot is really about things like the Western Sahara, for example. So Morocco is really trying, as we've seen with the recent normalization of relationships with Israel, Morocco's really tried to get other countries to support its claims on the Western Sahara as an integral part of the Moroccan territory. And one of the things that happened with Morocco rejoining the African Union in 2017 was to get a bunch of West African countries on board saying, yes, the Western Sahara is Moroccan. So I think partially it has to do with that. But this thing that you said about whether the term African, how it's used by Moroccans themselves, my sense, and Iza, please correct me if you have a different sense of how it's been used. I haven't been to Morocco in 3 or 4 years now, thanks to COVID. But while I was there, it always really was used to talk about sub-Saharan Africans, right? And so famously, there were signs that started popping up in the early 2010s, for example, for an apartments saying, we do not rent to El Afariqa, we do not rent to Africans, meaning we don't rent to sub-Saharan African immigrants. Right. And so there, just as you said with the Algerian person that you met, there's a sense of Moroccans saying like, oh, yes, there's a lot of Africans here, by which they don't necessarily mean themselves. Right. At the same time, I have Moroccan friends who, when Morocco rejoined the African Union, started posting all over Facebook, finally, I'm African again. Right. So it's fraught terminology, and people are still sort of figuring out what it means with relation to them in their country.
Thank you.
Eliza?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have 2 potentially really simple, straightforward questions. The first is about if you could speak more about the ramifications of the standardization process and the associations that the new standard of Darija carries. And I don't know, yeah, and you can talk more about how you can assess that, but I figure it's 15 years out from that shift you identified. And also, how is this playing out in alternative media or not mass media? And how does that timeline sort of compare to broadcast?
Okay, so the ramifications of this sort of standardization process of Darija. I mean, what I think is really fascinating about it is it has a potential to do the very standard Lingant thing of sort of creating, right, a national standard where Moroccans can sort of have this national voice from nowhere, right? A voice that doesn't denote you specifically being from Casablanca or from Fez or from Rabat, but is just sort of a neutral voice. And that process has been a lot slower than in Morocco than it has been in other countries. And so some people have studied this in terms of writing. So Egypt, for example, there was a study done by the FAFO Institute, which is a Norwegian institute, that looked at the relative levels of standardization of colloquial writing in Arabic, and they did a comparative study of Morocco and Egypt. And they found that Egypt was way advanced in terms of having really clear ways to write Egyptian Arabic. Moroccan ways of writing Egyptian Arabic, conversely, were like all over the board. Sometimes it was Arabic letters, sometimes it was Roman alphabet, sometimes it included numbers, sometimes it had diacritics, sometimes it didn't have diacritics, sometimes it was connected to the way standard Arabic was written, sometimes it didn't. So it's really, the experience of standardizing the national is really different in Morocco than it is in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And one person has argued that this is because, unlike countries like Egypt, where I think like a quarter of the population lives in Cairo. So it's really easy to say, okay, Cairene is the prestige register. Morocco doesn't have one big city like that, right? So it's actually much harder to figure out which dialect becomes the standard dialect. And so a lot of this stuff gets done in Casablanca, which is certainly the largest city, but historically, culturally, not the most important or prestigious city. And so I didn't really get into this, but sort of famously, Casablancan dialect is seen as being really rough, really masculine, really uneducated, actually kind of countryside in comparison to dialects coming from places like Rabat or Fez or Tetuan that are seen as much more refined and much more feminine. And so anyways, all of it just to say that sort of the creation of this Moroccan national standard has been much slower and much more fraught than in other Arabic speaking countries. But I think it is a way for Moroccans to, again, sort of rethink what their nation is, their sense of their nation, the value of their nation. And what's important for me is to really think of it not as part of the Arab world, right? But to sort of think of Moroccan Arabic as a language unto itself, which is not just Arab, but it's also African and Berber and all of these other things combined. And so it sort of cuts them off from all of this devaluation that they've been subject to, which to me is the most interesting part of the standardization process, slow standardization process. I hope that answers the first part of your question. Can you remind me what your second question was?
The second was, how is it playing out in alternative media or like not mass/broadcasted media context?
Yeah. How is it playing out in, I mean, it's really running wild is what I would say. It's happening to some extent in standard broadcasting like on Deuxième, but in alternative media, Derija is all over the place. Written, spoken, formal versions of it, informal versions of it. And so somebody who's done a lot of research on this, for example, is Dominique Cobet, who's at INALCO in Paris, who's done a lot of research on these sorts of informal uses of Derija on blogs, in slam poetry, in YouTube videos. Isa has also done research on Derija in YouTube videos, I will say. So it's really, alternative media is also really a place where this is happening, although it's not particularly the place that I look at the most.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. John, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed that. I was getting ready to ask you about the Western Sahara and you brought it up, but I still do have a question about that. Actually, I should mention before that I just found this really eye-opening to see what's going on. My own research is in Liberia, and so what I've seen about the relationship of North Africa to West Africa, this really seems like a change. My question about, I got two questions. The one about Western Sahara is, yes, the king, by rejoining the African Union, can work with West African states to get support for Morocco in the ongoing battle. But do Moroccans and also immigrants, does this matter to them? Is Western Sahara a big issue? Is it a matter of national pride, or it just doesn't matter that much? And my other question is completely different. The king's father certainly had, it seemed to me, fairly strong ties with France, as well as a residence near the Bois de Boulogne. Does the current king, what's his relationship with France as he's moved away from the Arab world? What's his relationship with France?
Thank you so much for those questions. Those are excellent. So in terms of the Western Sahara, and I'm glad you brought it up, it's really important, especially now. I feel like it's been in the news more with everything happening with the normalization of Israel in a variety of countries. It's hard for me to know to what extent it really matters to the average Moroccan, because it's a really sensitive topic to bring up in ordinary discussion. It would be really hard for me to sort of, over coffee be like, well, do you really care about the Western Sahara? In part because I think people feel uncomfortable talking about it, and in part because I think they might be uncomfortable talking about it in front of other people, right? You can't really sort of say in a cafe next to somebody else, no, I don't care at all about the Western Sahara, right? So it's hard for me to get a gauge on that. That said, I would hazard a guess that I do think it is fairly important symbolically for the average Moroccan, just in things I've sort of in offhand ways heard people say, and things that I've seen recently in online forums and people talking about this. And in sort of some various moments I experienced during my field work. So I remember at one point being at a music festival in Essaouira, in part because it's a world music festival where they bring in a lot of African musicians. And so I wanted to sort of see how Africa was played up in this one particular concert. I think the guest of honor in that was Senegal. And they had this amazing opening scene that featured a Moroccan artist, a Western Sahrawi artist, and a Senegalese artist, sort of showing visually the continuity of Morocco all the way across West Africa, in a way sort of visually symbolically claiming Western Sahara as part of this. And the Moroccan singer ended up singing this song, Sahara Maghribiya, the Sahara is Moroccan, and got the entire audience including French speakers, including West Africans there, to all chant this song in a very excited manner. And so I do think that there is at least really a popular sentiment that Western Sahara is important to the average Moroccan, I would say. So hopefully that answers to some extent that first question. In terms of Mohammed VI's relationship with France, it's fairly strong. It's a strong trade relationship. It's also politically a strong relationship. I know, for example, that in the sort of spate of ISIS-related attacks that have happened in France, Morocco was really key in providing data on the perpetrators that they had of some of these crimes. And so Morocco does still really have strong diplomatic and political close relationships with France. And you can see it also just economically because, I mean, all of the infrastructure in Morocco is really French. The trains are, cars are to a large extent, a lot of the shops are, I mean, it's, I've heard people say that it's Morocco's relationship with France is stronger now than it was during the colonial period. And I think that that's something that the country is really courting. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Cece.
Thank you, Kristin. Such an interesting talk. And I just assigned, I'm friends with Cecile Evers, who works on North African youth in Marseille, in France, and just assigned one of her articles to class that I taught just the other day. So it was so interesting because in this piece that was published in 2018, it's about these very similar kind of top-down efforts by the French government and by local French authorities and the education authorities there in Marseille to kind of reinscribe or reimagine North African youth as part of a larger kind of Mediterranean culture, as kind of reimagining, instead of thinking of North Africans as being, again, part of some sort of Arabization project, rather as reimagining them as part of Mediterranean Europe and connecting to the Greco-Roman heritage, and also of instituting MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, kind of supplementary language courses for them, and how these youth then reject that because they associate MSA with religiosity. And so I just wondered if you might comment on that. It's so interesting to imagine the French government also initiating these efforts to kind of bring North Africa into its sphere of influence, and also to influence these young people in France.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And this thing about the French government promoting MSA, sort of standard Arabic, and it being rejected by Maghrebian youth in France is super fascinating to me, because actually at a previous moment, I can't remember what year it was, I think it was in the early 2000s, there had actually been a push for on the baccalaureate in France, the sort of high school diploma, for students to be able to take the foreign language test, not in standard Arabic, but in dialects. And the idea was that they would be able to take it in dialects. It's written, right? And so they would be able to write it in any way that they wanted. They could write it in, you know, sort of like Latin alphabet. They could write it in Arabic letters. They could write it any way they wanted, and that would count. But I think this only lasted for like 3 to 4 years in France on the baccalaureate. And then what I've heard sort of secondhand is that the Arabists in France, by which I don't mean ideological, although I guess also ideological, but sort of the Arabization, right, the Arabic language professors really cracked down. They were really upset by this. Again, in this pan-Arabist language ideology, saying absolutely not, we can have students taking these high school exams in the colloquial dialects. It has to be in standard Arabic or nothing. And so that's what the situation is now, which I guess interestingly, sort of North African youth are pushing back against. But it is interesting that in an earlier moment, Darija was getting more recognition to some extent in Europe than it ever was in Morocco. So even though there is this push for there to be sort of more programming, etc. in Darija, it's not, if you saw, it's not mentioned in the constitution. It's not constitutionally mentioned as one of the languages of Morocco, although Amazigh, as of the 2011 constitution, is. And so actually, officially, Darija's gotten the most recognition, not in the countries where it's spoken as a first language, but in Europe. And I know similarly in Spain, there's sort of been a push to recognize North African Arabic as an official language of Spain, in the same way that there's all these other official languages of Spain. And this has especially been a push in Ceuta, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, Spain still has 2 colonies territorially located on Morocco in the north, these 2 little cities on the border of the Mediterranean, Ceuta and Melilla. And so yeah, there's been a push to recognize Moroccan Arabic, North African Arabic as a legal official language of Spain based on that, which is pretty fascinating. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but.
No, that's fine. I was just interested in a comment. Thank you so much.
We have a question in the chat that I'll read from Mickey Makihara. Thank you, Kristin, for the really wonderful talk. I would like to ask if you can elaborate a little more on what is going on with kinds of Darija practices and ideologies in the process you describe here. Are there kinds of linguistic, paralinguistic, and pragmatic features that are being noticed / created, and what kinds of Darija, if possible, beyond regional varieties and highlighted for their associations with different social distinction and hierarchy?
Yeah. So interestingly, from what I've noticed, a lot of the discussion actually is about regional variety, but regional variety in a way that gets sort of laminated onto class. So ideologically, sort of the way that Arabic works within Morocco is that there's 2 waves of Arabic that came into Morocco. There's Hilali and there's pre-Hilali. These are tribes that came in from the Arabian Peninsula into Morocco, and that brought in 2 different Arabic varieties with them. And so for anyone who speaks Arabic, sort of the way that this is, some of the noticeable features in that are that in one of the varieties, you would hear, for example, qaf or a g in place of it. And in the other variety, you would hear a or a glottal stop instead of the qa. And so the glottal stop is really typical of Middle Eastern varieties. So Egyptian does this, Syrian does this, Lebanese does this, basically all of the Middle Eastern varieties of Arabic. Instead of saying haqiqa, you would say ha'i'a, for example. And so this is still the case in, for example, for the sort of old elite Andalusian families of Tetuan or the old families of Rabat, especially the women, they still speak in this way. And this is something that Atika Hashemi, for example, has done research on with women from Fez who end up moving to Casablanca. They maintain these sorts of ways of speaking. But really, increasingly, what people are gravitating towards, I would say, is, as I mentioned before, this sort of Casablancan Arabic, which is more sort of like guttural, more masculine. It does the qa, it does the ga, it does sort of like the ta. And it's seen as rough and uneducated to some extent, which is precisely why it's been so difficult to even think that as a national standard in any way, because it's really, it turns people off. Not all people, but it turns a lot of Moroccans off enough that it's difficult for people to sort of rally around it as a voice from nowhere within Morocco. And so that's sort of the main, I would say, the regional is sort of the main distinction there, but it does end up sort of fractally mapping down, right? And so within Casablanca itself, sort of instead of the feminine being these northern varieties I talked about and the masculine being these southern varieties like Casablanca, in Casablanca itself, sort of the more urban people speak in ways that are seen as being more feminine and softer. The rural is sort of things that are being sort of more masculine and harsh. And so, and then sort of the urban and the rural ends up matching with class as well. So yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if I answered that completely, but hopefully that gives you some sense.
And then we can do Michael and then Renee.
My question, you mentioned a few times Tamazight, but sort of never centered a question like around it. What is the role of Tamazight vis-a-vis the Tamazight varieties really, vis-a-vis the Darija and Modern Standard Arabic?
Yeah, so Tamazight, or Berber, sort of, as you mentioned, right, it's not just one language, it's multiple languages, some of which are sort of seen as mutually incomprehensible. So the northern variety is harder to understand for people coming from the center and the south. And they are officially recognized in the Constitution now. And as a result of that, you're seeing them taught more in schools, although still in a limited sense, right? By no means are all Moroccans getting bilingual education in Arabic and one of the Tamazight languages. And you're seeing it more symbolically. So sort of now when you're walking down the streets, any government bureaucracy has its title in French and in standard Arabic and in Tamazight, right? It's sort of, it's there visually, but it's maybe not implemented as much on the ground, I would think. But really, what I find fascinating about it is I've been asked before if there's been any affinities between the sort of Berber language activists and the Darija activists promoting Moroccan Arabic. And you would think that they would have an affinity for them, for each other, right? Especially before the Tamazight languages were officially recognized in the Constitution. And yet that's not at all the case. And if anything, I think there's some sense of animosity because people that are really pushing Moroccan Arabic, right? They see it as the national language. That's the language that they use, right? That's why they call it Maghribiya, Moroccan. And that, I think, to Amazigh activists is threatening. It's a new form of Arabization, speaking a slightly different language and yet making the exact same arguments and hence threatening to sort of erase Berber from the picture, right? Except instead of standard Arabic doing it, now it's Moroccan Arabic that's doing it. So you would think that there would be sort of more affinity between these two movements, but actually there's a lot of animosity, I would say. Yeah.
Renee?
Thank you so much for this talk. It was absolutely wonderful and enlightening. My question is, so you're really working on spoken language, but I was just curious about like the sounds of the background, so things like song and singing, and especially I don't know if dubbing people think about like the singing that happens as well. And I was wondering if that the songs that you hear undermine or reinforce kind of this Africanness or Europeanness. Thank you again.
Do you mean the songs in dubbing, or?
It can be the songs in dubbing, or even the songs, the songs that also go along with these kinds of undermine this kind of push towards Africanness or Europeanness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. In the dubbing studio, I would say there really isn't too much of a discourse of Africanness at all in the dubbing studio, but absolutely music is one of these spaces where I feel like a Moroccan African identity is really being played out. And so you hear this in the kinds of melodies, you hear this in the kinds of instruments, you hear this in lyrics where people are literally singing about being African and African unity in Moroccan Arabic. Even if it's just symbolic, right, it's really coming out in lyrics. And you're seeing more and more sort of uptake of African artists by Moroccans. So there's all of these programmings now, a lot, unsurprisingly, sponsored by the monarchy, bringing in artists from Mali, bringing in artists from Senegal, not only to play enormous concerts in Morocco, but also to do sort of fusion concerts with Moroccan artists as a way to sort of display the affinity that these two regions have for each other, right? That it's actually one region at the end of the day. And so, yeah, thank you for bringing up music. That's absolutely been sort of a privileged site for the promotion of African identity in Morocco.
Thank you, because I was just thinking like background rhythms, because I hadn't even realized in the United States that we are so influenced by Afro beats. When I stopped to actually stopped hearing people speaking and listen to the background music and noises in the public, that I recognized that we were so influenced by Afro beats. I was just curious how that had also manifested there. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay, let's see. Yes. Britta, do you want to say your question out loud, or I can read it?
Oh, sure. I was sort of amusing. I was thinking about, as Kristin was talking about Tamazight, and just sort of, I'm wondering about sort of the role of sort of African identity as stepping in or standing in for circumventing some of these tensions that arose out of Arabism and sort of the exclusion of Berber identity from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it. And I would definitely say that I've seen a lot of sort of Berber activists and people who promote their Berber identity are the same people who are sort of eagerly taking up their African identity. And they do really see, I think they really do see them as being united, in part because of what you're saying, that it's a way to sort of push back against the kind of schisms or devaluation that ends up happening with Pan-Arabism. Yeah, great, thank you.
So it's 3:30. I mean, we can wrap up unless there's any lingering questions that anyone has. Otherwise, I would say, let's say thank you again to Kristin. Use your Zoom reactions if you want to, or however you like to show appreciation on Zoom. Thank you so much. And I hope all of you will be able to join us next semester as well. We should, so I'm going to leave it to the other organizers to decide, but I'm guessing given the Graduate Center's policy that will be virtual, so hopefully many of you will be able to join. But thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the semester.